Welcome to Accommodate This. My name is David, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic adult. So a little bit about myself. I lost my job in 2023, and it was because I reported abuses that I was suffering by my coworkers. When I went to my manager asking for help, instead of providing support, she exploited my vulnerabilities and made it a very difficult place to work. It got more and more toxic every day. And so I eventually had to reach out to HR. But they ultimately sided with my manager, who was right in their ear, telling them things that they wanted to hear. By the time I was speaking to them, my points didn't matter because they already had the story in their heads about what they wanted to believe. So then I thought, well, why don't I go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. That's the branch of government here in the United States that protects people who are in the minority, and they'll help us to fight battles like these. They ended up having such a narrow definition of bullying, it was comical. They referred to bullying as name calling, and I'm like, it can be a lot more complex than that. But that ended up being a dead end. And so then I tried to pursue a lawyer, and I reached out to several different law firms, didn't get some responses from some. Others, they wanted a bunch of information that I couldn't provide because it was protected by the company that I was from, and I'm not allowed to share that information. At the end, the lawyers that finally talked to me, they all said, well, it's not illegal to lie. And that was really hard for me to hear because it was very defeating to hear. How could this be my reality? How could something like this happen when the system had told me for years and years that they would be there to protect me in cases like this? And that brings me to today. I've decided to use my own voice to address these issues and the discrimination and injustice that occurs out there all the time. I really want to shine a light on these issues and put up a mirror in front of the faces of neurodivergent and the neurotypical communities to say, look at what we're doing to each other. This isn't a healthy arrangement here. It's not about one side being better than the other. It's about us learning to work together toward common solutions. I'm going to base this a lot on studies that I've found, and I'll link to them in the description. But if you want more details than what I'm showing here, feel free to go and look at those yourself. There's a lot of really good information in them, and they reach a lot of amazing conclusions. That brings us to the topic of this video, lies. Let's get into it. Most of us would admit that on the surface, lies are a terrible thing, and we should avoid telling them. But it's really not that cut and dry. Not all lies are equal. You could probably tell your friend that, oh, those clothes don't really make you look fat. Or maybe you cheated in a game to win at a game of cards. Or maybe you just lied to end a discussion, to get out of an argument. Whatever the reason, lies, they can be fun, they can be flirty, or they can be dangerous, and a whole bunch of other things in between. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And regardless of your moral stance, lies have actually played a huge part in our human history. Many of our social norms even require us to lie as a common courtesy. Lies are built into the fabric of our society. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does make it challenging for those of us who don't really understand the rules of social interaction. And that encompasses a lot of the neurodivergent community. And that's just because it wasn't designed around the way our brains work. But let's look at some of these institutionalized lies. In the United States, where I'm from, the First Amendment to our Constitution guarantees our right to free speech. And that includes our right to tell lies, almost any lie you want. But there's really only 5 lies that are considered punishable under the Constitution. So let's take a look at those now. The first of these is defamation. Defamation is the act of using false statements to damage someone's reputation. And we're all pretty familiar with this one from television and movies and such. So I won't get too much into that. But there's another type of punishable lie called the false light tort. And it's very similar to defamation, but it is more about misleading statements. So let me give you an example. Imagine a newspaper prints a report about a church with child molestation going on. and they use the image of an innocent priest for the article. Well, that would be considered false light tort because that image implies that the priest was guilty. But if they came out and outright said, no, this priest is guilty of it, then that would be defamation. So that's the difference there. Okay, one is an implication and the other one is outright saying it. Lie number 3 that is punishable is perjury. So this is things like lying under oath or lying to authorities, like the police or a government official. And it's also very quite common to hear about this type of lie on TV. Then there's fraud. And what I found, really the only fraud that mattered for this issues of this topic were the times when you were doing it to make money. Otherwise, it was just like a slap on the wrist. Okay. I'm not a lawyer though, so don't quote me on that. I didn't dig too hard on this one. Number 5, any lie that inflicts severe emotional distress is considered punishable. But the problem with this is it's too subjective. Who's to say what severe means? We all have different levels of tolerance, though what this ends up becoming is just a huge hole in the law, and it's exploited a lot. In fact, the courts even exploit this. Any of these 5 types of lies can land you in a lot of trouble. There's also 8 more that could land you in trouble if you happen to be part of the government. I won't cover these all one by one, but I'll just quickly show a list of these, and you'll see that they're pretty much just different flavors of the 5 that I already discussed. But altogether, it gives us 13 lucky laws. I don't feel lucky. These 13 laws are the only ones that consider lies to be punishable. Only those 13 types. Everything else is protected under free speech. To me and my brain, that's just like, what? Why would we do that to ourselves? How do you ever expect to know anything to any degree of certainty if we're not honest with ourselves and each other? Wouldn't it be better if we just didn't lie at all? Why don't we outlaw all of them? The Supreme Court says lies can actually be used to protect people, so they have kind of a loophole there. So for example, the President of the United States may need to lie in order to protect government secrets. Otherwise, that could put thousands and millions of lives at risk. And none of us would argue against that. But that's just one extreme example of the types of lies that might be encountered. But that kind of lie there is considered a form of principled lying. And a lot of people across the country depend on principled lying all the time. Think of a nurse in a hospital who lies to the terminally ill patient saying, oh no, you'll be fine, just rest, knowing that they're not going to be fine. That kind of lie is a principled lie, but that particular one actually has its own term called benevolent deceit. Oh. Benevolent deceit can actually be prescribed like a medication because they consider it therapeutically necessary. So in that way, it's also embedded into that part of our society, the medical field. And when you see a lie like a benevolent deceit, you can look at it as, well, that's just an act of compassion. They just are helping to ease their transition from this life. Most of these lies, the principled lies and benevolent lies, they don't really impact other people, okay? Not that much, not in the big scheme of things. But a system like this is not without its issues. If we try to scale this up to the rest of society, it doesn't work. So for example, if you work in an office setting, you're probably not making life or death decisions all day. You can still become stressed and your fight or flight can kick in to different pressures in your workplace. That reaction of your body and your mind is still very real. It's just like if you were being chased by a lion or if you were in the middle of a war zone. Your brain perceives it as just as terrifying. But we can lie to ourselves in those situations and just say, it's really not that bad, and calm ourselves down. But my point is that several different types of lies have different uses in our society. They've made their way in because they have utility. To reduce this down to lies are bad or lies are good is just black and white thinking. And I know that's very easy for the neurodivergent brain to think that way, but it really is more complicated than that. So let's talk about some terminology here. I'm going to use a word that you may not have heard before. It's called hegemony. And this is just a word to describe the dominant worldview that is held by the majority. You could think of it as this is the way that we think the world works, but it's always based on the majority. So if you're part of a majority, it may make sense to you. If you're not part of the majority, it can be very confusing. I have a different worldview myself because I do not belong to the hegemony. And so lying to me can be very uncomfortable. It seems very counterintuitive, counterproductive. It's just not a good thing in my brain. And that's not a judgment. That's just, I find it difficult. So I avoid it. I'm really bad at it. And you'll find that, at least amongst the autistic community, that's very common. Lying is not easy for autistics. It's because we have a strong sense of justice and we have very direct speech patterns. And dishonesty can be very triggering for us because we truly believe that honesty is a better thing for our society. We feel like it is part of our social expectations. And when you experience a lifetime of bullying and rejection and humiliation like we do at the hands of the majority, when we don't conform to a rule and we think that this is a rule, then we can be triggered when suddenly the rule changes. And that happens a lot. A lot of it is because of the lies that are just embedded in our society. So we learn from a really early age to conceal our differences so that we can avoid being hurt by the majority. And that is a form of lying in itself. But as the minority, we are forced into lying. And not just so that we fit in, but so that we avoid getting hurt. This kind of masking or hiding our true selves is a leading cause of what's known as minority stress. And the term minority stress was first coined in 2007 to describe the plight of the LGBTQ community. But it has a lot of parallels with the autistic and neurodivergent communities. Minority stress basically describes the day-to-day discrimination that we feel as a marginalized group. And we're constantly faced with expectations and experiences of rejection, never really certain whether it's safe to be honest about ourselves. And that leads to varying degrees of disclosure or outness. Not everyone will admit that they are autistic, especially if you're applying for a job, because you know it can be used against you. It's discrimination. And so we're expected to conceal our traits that give us away as part of the minority group. And that leads to a lot of internalized shame and stigma that's related to our identities. That can contribute to poor well-being and psychological distress. And a lot of studies show that minority stress has already been taking a huge toll on the autistic community. For example, did you know that autistics are 7 to 9 times more likely to commit suicide than non-autistics? And we have an average life expectancy anywhere between 36 and 54 years, which is significantly less than the life expectancy of the neuro-majority. And even though we aren't the only marginalized group, autistics are considered some of the most marginalized in society because we're often depicted as having social deficits, and therefore we're not worthy of full social integration or full personhood. You might be thinking, hey, come on, this can't be that bad. But study after study shows and confirms that this is the case. Every day we live in fear that we might be treated bad by our society just for doing what comes naturally to us, even if it doesn't hurt anyone else. And so we hide in a form of hiding that's called masking or camouflaging. And studies show that masking and camouflaging have significant negative impacts on both autistic development and our overall mental health. And that's because it forces us into a vicious cycle of lies and abuse. In fact, poor mental health is so common in the autistic community that it's typically what leads many of us to seek a diagnosis in the first place. At least that was the case for me. So as I mentioned before, masking is part of a vicious cycle of lying and abuse, and it's been tolerated in our society for way too long. You can find all kinds of charts and diagrams online that describe this and illustrate it, but I'm going to show you a chart that I put together based on my own experience and that makes sense to me. Let's take a look. The cycle begins with the expectation that everyone conforms to the same rules, regardless of your neurotype. But unfortunately, for many of us, these rules are based on the nature of the majority, and they don't often make sense to us, or they're not explained to us in a way that would make sense. So we often don't realize how flexible the rules are or how rigid they are. We might be caught off guard when they change, and that can be very triggering for an autistic brain. And to make matters worse, we're often punished by the majority when we inevitably get it wrong, because it's just not intuitive. And then when we are punished, it feels like all our efforts to conform were in vain because they found out anyways. Masking your true self is a lie that exacerbates minority stress, and it can have dire effects on people, no matter who you are. There was a study done in 2011 of a company based in the UK. They outsourced a high-volume call center in India, and they wanted it to be a seamless experience for all of their customers. So they told their employees that they had to conceal their ethnicity, physical location. They had to make up anglicized names and speak with British accents. And then they even had to make stories up about their background so that they were believable. And then managers used call monitoring to make sure that when they evaluated those calls, that the quality of the accents was okay. And then that was tied to their performance and earnings. So that turned these lies into material components of their job. And that created a lot of stigma because their identities were seen as the source of shame. And the same thing happens to autistics or anyone in the neurodivergent community. But it didn't end there. Their problems compounded when customers realized the deceit. As soon as they realized, hey, this person isn't who they say they are, they suddenly became very upset. And research reported higher levels of uncertainty and greater levels of emotional energy during those calls because the employees were trying to reconcile management demands for pretense with customer skepticism. And then the customer, knowing that they were lied to, would become very offensive and even overtly racist. And that resulted in unequal power dynamics, and not to mention stress and role ambiguity and alienation. But a lot of those feelings that they encountered were feelings that you would feel naturally in a confrontational situation. And they would get these every time they were on the call, whether there was an argument or not. It really gave them this weird power dynamic where they felt like they couldn't do anything about the imbalance between themselves and their customers, and they couldn't go to management for help to curb the abuse. Can you imagine this happening today? Well, it does. It happens a lot. And not just on the racial side, but on the neurodivergent side. We are expected to mask our natural selves in order to fit in or to avoid the consequences of being different in a neuro-minority society, in the current hegemony. And the problem with that is we are actually forcing the minority to be shamed about their identities. The expectation to conform forces the marginalized minority to don a mask, and we do that to avoid mistreatment, but it doesn't always work. Masking bypasses the visibility component that's baked into the current hegemony, and it creates an illusion that we're functioning when we're really struggling a lot. Those who are part of the minority, we understand we're forced to suppress our nature and compromise our values all the time just to stay safe. And at the same time, the biased hegemony denies us of our agency and our autonomy. And that's why neurotypical behavior is seen as the peak of normality, and anything else is dysfunctional. But it's not true. It's all a lie. As I mentioned in the outsourcing example, studies show that masking our authentic selves comes at a great cost. It can cost a lot of energy and effort to pretend to be someone or something you're not. It takes a toll on our self-esteem. In fact, self-hatred abounds in this model because our identities are seen as a source of shame. And that produces a sense of inferiority that then further worsens our mental health. For autistics, this can lead to more frequent and more severe meltdowns and shutdowns. Eventually, we reach a point where we just can't do it anymore. The mask begins to fail and we hit burnout. I myself have been struggling with autistic burnout for the last 5 years, and it feels like only recently I've been able to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Meanwhile, I've lost skills that I once had, skills that allowed me to blend in easier, skills that allowed me to interact with people easier. But I reached a level of such utter exhaustion that my brain said enough, and I've lost those skills. I would not wish autistic burnout on anyone. It is terrible, but that's a topic for another video. I want to get to the last step in this cycle, which really isn't the last step, because it could occur at any point in the cycle, but I just placed it here because it was easiest. And it can occur multiple times throughout the cycle. But basically, we reach a point where we are asking for help. We're asking for some sort of change to relieve the stress that we're under. And in my case, I reached out for an accommodation. I did it because I felt trapped between pleasing everybody to the detriment of myself or pleasing nobody. And that's not a good choice. Neither of those are good options. So I reached out for help and I asked for accommodations to reduce the toll of stress that the system had on me. But the majority often lacks understanding of the neurodivergent experience. And it makes sense when you think about it because we've been masking the whole time. We've hidden that struggle from them. They benefit from being part of the majority, so they really only see what they experience and think everyone's experience is the same when we hide ours. So for them, the way society works is natural, and they've never had to even learn how to get along with anyone in the minority because the minority has been working so hard to appease the hegemony based on the majority. We're struggling to fit in and to follow their rules that don't make sense to us, and they just don't see that as a problem. It contributes to the illusion that our disabilities are invisible when they really aren't. I mean, I can tell you from an early age, people would notice really quickly, you're weird. It was something I tried to hide, but it's not invisible. They saw something in me that I wasn't aware of. To the majority, as soon as we fall out of step with the current expectations, they don't see it as a sign of our struggle. For them, we just stop functioning for no reason, and our pleas for help are just dismissed as some kind of tantrum. Because to them, we were fully capable the day before. Why aren't we capable now? We should just continue doing what we've always done. And that's what's expected of them, so that's what they expect for us. And so they just reassert the current hegemony, and they reassert that, hey, just follow the system. It works for all of us. Why are you struggling? And that's not only dismissive, but it also helps them to avoid any blame or take responsibility for their contribution in the cycle. And in my case, when I asked HR to protect me from my bully and to provide basic accommodations, their rejection was very devastating. It felt like I was being rejected by the system that I had paid so much into and tried so hard to uphold. And I believed that when they had told me in the past that I'd be protected from situations like the bullying that I experienced, and I wouldn't be retaliated against for reporting abuses in good confidence. I honestly believed that, but those ended up being lies as well. And so the cycle ends up continuing. On and on, we continue forcing ourselves in the minority to push ourselves further than anyone in the majority could ever imagine, and to conform to a system that deprives us of our own needs, and then yanks the rug of justice out from under our feet. And because we're in the minority, we're just expected to put up with it until we die. I know this sounds really dark, but the solution to me seems pretty obvious. Just imagine if we changed the majority's worldview to be more inclusive of the neuro-minority. All it would take is a little understanding, tolerance, and compassion, and then the entire cycle could go away. In my mind, I really believe that if we focused on honesty, loyalty, and fairness, instead of trying to preserve this web of uncomfortable lies, we could accomplish so much more together. But I know we're a long way from realizing a dream like that. I know that lies are expected because we need to conform, and they're built into the fabric of our society, especially this capitalist society that we belong to. It encourages competition and sometimes to the extreme, so you feel like lying is your only option. There was actually a study that showed how a direct sales organization institutionalized material lies, where workers would initially missell to customers in order to generate financial returns. And that is the definition of a material lie. The study highlighted how deception was sanctioned by the workplace, and they did this through the construction of differences. So from the customers that they sold to themselves, they established differences, saying the customer was the common enemy. And they even described them as gullible, stupid, and boring. And they did this all to justify lying to them. And it gave the sales group this sense of superiority. But at first, it seemed like a good thing because it strengthened peer relationships and resulted in cooperation and support in the team. But that's just convincing themselves that the ends justified the means. And in that way, the company legitimized and sanctioned deception. You might be wondering, why didn't their leaders do anything about it? Well, the studies also showed that those who are higher on the corporate ladder are more likely to lie, and they do it to solidify their position or to secure a project that they wanted. And how they do it is they usually try to make their peers look less suitable than they are so that they can get it. But that's not all the time. How often do they really need to go looking for a higher position? So the study also showed that the lies that were told were periodic. They're based on certain circumstances. It wasn't an all day, all the time thing, but it still did, even if lies were happening once in a while, it still promoted a culture of lies. And that can get out of hand. In 2008, the company Enron, they were completely destroyed from within because of their system of lies. They had rampant deception that ended up leading them to bankruptcy. And if you lived through this crisis, you might remember how devastating it was because it affected the global economy and had wide-ranging impacts over several industries. So how did that happen? Just like most things, it started out small and grew gradually over time. The studies show that the ease of lying, the severity of it, and the pervasiveness all increased over time until the organization could not operate without lying. It had been embedded directly and indirectly into their day-to-day procedures. They couldn't do anything without lying. So that's an extreme case too. Luckily, that's very rare, but encouraging lies is kind of a slippery slope, and it can be a dangerous thing. So the trap is no less real to all of us. So we've talked about legal lies, principled lies, benevolent lies, and a lot of different lies in between. They exist because they serve a purpose. They have utility in the current hegemony. And that leaves us to wrestle with the fact that lying really isn't as cut and dry as good person tells truth, bad person tells lies. The researchers took this a little bit further and said, it's not even correct for us to label people as liars, because lies are just simply what someone would do in a certain situation. It's not a personality trait, it's a tool. So lying is neither right nor wrong, it's simply a means to an end. An example that was shared was a study of a police department where the police officers would falsely testify against a suspect to ensure that they were convicted. And when that happened, everyone in the police department felt that was a legitimate thing to do. They didn't see it as malicious. They thought it was a powerful tool for justice. But it's cultures like that that we need to worry about. Cultures that develop their own moral code within the workplace just provides an ethical infrastructure that can lead employees to becoming complicit in lying. And this can be the case for cultures promoting a high degree of competition or conflict as well. So for example, employees may engage in dark acts like sabotaging the career of a colleague or spreading false rumors and causing reputational harm to an individual. That happened to me. It's very real. And unfortunately, it's quite common to see individuals negatively portray another person just to secure a position over their competitors. I was ultimately terminated for this kind of behavior because I couldn't combat all the lies being told about me. And it was almost like my termination from employment was a second death after the assassination of my character. But micropolitics like this are often a foreign concept to the neurodivergent brain. We struggle to grapple with the fact that they're simply a function of the society we live in. And when the majority worldview promotes malicious lies and ensures coworkers lie to secure their self-interests, it just leads to a loss of trust from the company, their clients, and their colleagues. But time and again, researchers noticed malicious lies became more prevalent in organizations with lots of conflict between coworkers, or where there's competition for scarce resources, or where there were power asymmetries. Employers also tend to get away with it because they're bigger, they have more power, more money, they have a larger team of lawyers to help cover up their lies. And if you're a small person like me, you just simply can't financially afford to go after them. And so they just feel more and more confident the more they get away with it. And then there's no real incentive for them to do the right thing. Get this, I said that it would be better if we had more honesty, loyalty, and fairness, but studies have shown there's a link between lying and loyalty. Loyalty is usually a trait that our society claims to value, and it's valuable in relationships, in our communities, in our institutions. Loyal people are seen as better family members, better friends, better leaders, and loyalty fosters trust and cooperation, while disloyalty leads to negative reactions. But ironically, despite valuing loyalty, studies show that loyal employees are often exploited in the workplace. There's this unspoken expectation that self-sacrifice is a part of being a loyal employee. And then their reputation for dedication can make them even more vulnerable to unfair practices like working extra hours or taking on excessive work, tolerating poor treatment. This creates a cycle that perpetuates itself because their willingness to endure hardship reinforces their reputation as a loyal employee. And then management will capitalize on that, and they basically benefit from all those sacrifices without having to provide anything in return. And that places employees in a vulnerable position because management holds all the keys. They control incentives like promotions and job security. By exploiting this power, management can demand extra work without compensation. And that just leaves employees feeling pressured to comply or risk losing their jobs and all the security that comes with it. Many neurodivergent people understand how desperate it can feel to be marginalized and manipulated in this way. And we often overcompensate by fawning or people-pleasing. And that just perpetuates the cycle because fawning is seen as self-sacrifice. And while loyalty, fairness, and honesty are considered universal values, in practice, dishonesty is encouraged and loyal workers are exploited. The trend is particularly concerning for neuro-minorities because we know that promoting conformity over diversity is ineffective. We truly believe in loyalty, fairness, and honesty, and many of us are growing weary of supporting a flawed system that overlooks our needs and seems detrimental to a good business model. But there is hope. As awareness of neurodiversity grows, I predict that we will see a decline in society's reliance on lies and the competitive nature of the current hegemony. It may be naive, but I believe a better future is possible, one that celebrates honesty, integrity, loyalty, fairness, inclusion, and diversity of thought, future that many of us dream of. And although the current hegemony expects us to mask, we know that masking is a double-edged sword because it harms employers who lose out on reliable employees, and it harms neurodivergent individuals who have to hide ourselves. In a neurotypical dominated world, privilege favors the majority, and they mistakenly attribute that to superiority rather than social advantage. While some believe that masking leads to success, studies show people mask primarily to avoid negative consequences, not to fit in. And masking has significant developmental consequences for neurodivergent individuals, including poor mental health, exhaustion, suicidality, identity loss, and other minority stressors. And yet the benefits of social and professional inclusion remain barriers to our unmasking. I know this topic can be quite difficult to discuss. I would prefer a world based on logic and sincerity that embraces our differences. I would prefer that we divorced ourselves from our dependence on lies. But until we confront the harmful nature of the current hegemony, I'm afraid that the needs of the neuro-minority are going to continue to be ignored, and we will continue to die prematurely. It's time for all of us to wake up and recognize the manipulation of this flawed system. We shouldn't have to rely on dishonesty. We must be brave enough to stand up for truth and justice. We must treat each other better and with more compassion, and start relying more on open and honest communication. People like me don't really have a choice in this matter. We have to challenge the conventions of our current system because it's killing us at an alarming rate.